5:33 a.m. Gulf of Oman. Southern approach. The horizon ahead is still dark when the USS Gerald Ford begins her turn north. The movement is deliberate and unhurried, the kind of course change that 5,000-ton warships make when their commanders have time and intention on their side rather than urgency. But everyone aboard the carrier who understands what north means from this position understands what the turn signifies. North from the Gulf of Oman leads to one place, through the Strait of Hormuz, into the Persian Gulf, toward the Iranian coastline that has been the subject of every intelligence brief, every operational planning session, every quiet conversation between senior officers over the preceding 11 days. The USS Gerald Ford Strike Group is approaching Iranian waters. The movement had been building for 3 weeks in the specific way that American carrier deployments build, incrementally, visibly, with the deliberate transparency that distinguishes a deterrent signal from a covert operation. The Ford had departed Norfolk 17 days earlier in a deployment that the Pentagon had described publicly as a scheduled rotation to the 5th Fleet Area of Responsibility. The description was technically accurate. It was not complete. The timing of the deployment, the composition of the strike group accompanying the carrier, and the specific orders under which the group was operating had been shaped by a crisis that had been developing in the Persian Gulf region with a momentum that diplomatic efforts had repeatedly failed to slow. Iran had been escalating for 6 weeks. The pattern had begun with harassment operations against commercial shipping near the Strait of Hormuz, fast attack boat intercepts of tankers, radio challenges that crossed the line from standard maritime communication into deliberate intimidation, the kind of low-level pressure that Iranian forces had applied intermittently for years, but had been applying with unusual consistency and frequency over the preceding month and a half. It had progressed to the seizure of a Greek-flagged tanker, whose cargo Iran described as smuggled oil subject to confiscation under Iranian law, a legal characterization that no international maritime authority recognized, but that Iran enforced anyway, holding the vessel and her crew for 11 days before releasing them under circumstances that suggested a negotiated arrangement rather than a legal resolution. It had escalated further when ballistic missile tests conducted at an IRGC facility in Iran's southeastern desert produced telemetry data that American intelligence assessed as inconsistent with the stated purpose of the tests. The missiles being tested were not the research variants that Iran's public statements described. They were operational configurations, warhead-capable, range-tested against profiles that corresponded to targets in the northern Arabian Gulf where American naval assets were regularly positioned. The Ford's deployment north was the American response to 6 weeks of escalation that had not responded to any other form of communication. Diplomatic notes had been delivered and ignored. Informal back-channel communications had produced assurances that were contradicted within days by Iranian actions. Economic pressure through additional sanctions had generated statements of defiance rather than behavioral change. The carrier strike group moving north through the Gulf of Oman was the message that the preceding 6 weeks of communication had failed to deliver, a visible, undeniable demonstration of American military capability, and well positioned at the threshold of Iranian waters. Aboard the Ford, the mood was the specific combination of professional focus and personal awareness that characterizes a ship's company that understands its mission has moved from routine deployment to something with genuine operational stakes. The sailors and aviators who comprised the Ford's company were not afraid. Fear was not the dominant emotion in a crew that had trained extensively and believed in its equipment and its training. But they were alert in a way that routine deployments did not require, attentive to their duties with a sharpness that reflected the understanding that what they were doing mattered in ways that transcended the procedural. The strike group accompanying the Ford had been assembled with specific attention to the threat environment. 2 Ticonderoga-class cruisers whose Aegis systems provided the long-range air defense backbone that protected the formation against ballistic missile threats. 4 Arleigh Burke destroyers, whose SM-6 batteries and anti-submarine capabilities covered the middle and inner defensive layers. Two Virginia-class attack submarines running silent beneath the formation, their sensors building the undersea picture that surface assets could not construct. A fast combat support ship maintaining the fuel, ammunition, and stores that sustained the group's operational tempo indefinitely. Together, the formation represented a concentration of military capability that had no equivalent anywhere in the world, and it was moving north, toward Iran, at a pace that everyone watching, in Tehran, in Riyadh, in Moscow, in Beijing, in every capital where analysts tracked American carrier movements as a primary indicator of strategic intent, understood was not accidental and was not reversible without a decision being made somewhere. In Tehran, that decision was being debated with an urgency that the Ford's northward movement had imposed on a leadership that had been managing its own internal tensions about how far to push the current confrontation. Part 2. The Iranian response to the Ford's northward movement began not with military action, but with the specific combination of public declaration and private preparation that characterized how Tehran managed its most serious confrontations with American power. State media broadcast statements from IRGC commanders describing the carrier's approach as a provocation that Iran would not tolerate, language calibrated to satisfy domestic audiences, demanding that leadership project strength while stopping short of the specific military threats that would trigger immediate American countermeasures. Behind the public declarations, the preparation was more concrete and more concerning to American intelligence analysts monitoring it in real time. 3 Iranian ballistic missile sites that had been in standby configuration for the preceding 2 weeks went to active status within 18 hours of the Ford's course change north. The transition from standby to active, observable through the combination of satellite imagery showing shelter openings and fueling activity, and signals intelligence tracking the communications traffic that accompanied operational missile preparation, was not ambiguous. Iranian forces were not simply posturing, they were preparing options. IRGCN surface forces in the northern Gulf increased their operational tempo simultaneously. Fast attack boat squadrons that had been conducting their harassment operations on predictable patrol schedules began operating on irregular patterns, moving at irregular times, using routes that suggested deliberate attempts to reduce their predictability to American surveillance. Mine-laying vessels that had been berthed at their home bases for 3 weeks moved to forward staging locations closer to the strait approaches. 2 Iranian frigates sortied from Bandar Abbas and moved to positions in the central Gulf that placed them within potential engagement range of the Ford's projected transit route. The Iranian submarine force, 3 Kilo-class boats, and a collection of smaller midget submarines, was tracked by the Virginia-class boats running beneath the Ford's formation. 2 of the Kilos had submerged within 24 hours of the Ford's course change and had not been reacquired by American tracking assets with sufficient confidence to remove them from the threat picture. Submarines that cannot be located are submarines that must be treated as potential threats until proven otherwise, a principle that added a layer of anti-submarine focus to the strike group's defensive posture that consumed resources and attention throughout the transit. The Ford entered the Strait of Hormuz at 14:22 local time on the 3rd day of her northward movement. The transit was conducted at modified battle stations, not the full general quarters that a confirmed threat would trigger, but an elevated readiness state that reflected the understood risk of moving a carrier through 21 miles of water bordered on one side by a nation whose military forces had spent the preceding 72 hours preparing for exactly this moment. Iranian radar systems tracked the transit continuously. Iranian fast attack boats were visible on American radar throughout the passage, not approaching, not making threatening movements, but present and watching with an attentiveness that made their intent to observe impossible to mistake. An Iranian P-3 maritime patrol aircraft orbited at the edge of international airspace throughout the 3-hour transit, its crew photographing and recording every vessel in the formation with the thoroughness of professionals building a targeting database. The Ford completed her transit and entered the Persian Gulf at 17:41 local time. No shots fired, no provocative incidents. The crossing of the threshold had been accomplished without the kinetic confrontation that both sides had been preparing for, and neither side, at this specific moment, had wanted to initiate. But the threshold had been crossed. The ford was now in the Persian Gulf, 70 miles from the Iranian coastline, in waters that Iran's leadership considered its strategic domain. The deterrence signal had been delivered. The question that no signal could answer, whether it would be received and acted upon in the way the sender intended, remained open. Flight operations began 40 minutes after the transit was complete. The sound of F/A-18S launching from the ford's catapults rolled across the Gulf in the early evening air, audible to every vessel within miles, visible to Iranian radar operators whose screens showed American combat aircraft entering the airspace above the northern Gulf with the regularity of a force that intended to stay. The message in those launches was the same as the message in the carrier's northward movement: visible, deliberate, and impossible to misread. Iran watched and prepared, and the Persian Gulf held its breath in the specific way it always held its breath when the contest between American power and Iranian determination moved from the realm of words into the realm of steel and fuel and weapons that were no longer theoretical. Part 3. The first 3 days of the ford's Persian Gulf presence passed in a tension that was visible on every tactical display and in every intelligence brief, but that had not yet expressed itself in direct military action. Iranian forces maintained their elevated readiness posture. The missile sites remained active. The fast attack boat patrols continued their irregular patterns. The 2 missing Kilo submarines remained unlocated, a fact that the strike group's anti-submarine warfare teams treated as the most pressing, unresolved problem in their operational picture. On the 4th day, the situation changed. The change came not from Iranian military action but from the intelligence picture that American assets were building about what Iranian forces were preparing to do. A signals intelligence collection at 3:17 a.m. on the 4th day captured a communications exchange between an IRGC Naval Command facility and the commander of the fast attack boat squadron operating in the Central Gulf. The exchange was partially encrypted, but the portions that were readable contained specific operational language, timing references, coordinate ranges, weapons release authorization terminology, that the analysts processing the intercept assessed with high confidence as preparation orders for an offensive operation. The operation being prepared was not against the carrier. The targets referenced in the intercept were commercial vessels, specifically the 2 supertankers that had been tracked entering the southern approach to the strait in the preceding 12 hours, due to transit the choke point the following morning. Iran was preparing to strike commercial shipping again, using the ford's presence as political cover, framing the attack as a response to American aggression rather than an unprovoked offensive operation. The assessment reached the ford's strike group commander at 4:03 a.m. His response was immediate and operated on 2 tracks simultaneously. The first track was defensive, alerting the commercial vessels through the Maritime Operations Center in Bahrain, recommending they hold their positions south of the strait, pending a security assessment, buying time for the second track to develop. The second track was the operational question of whether American forces could and should act on the intelligence before the Iranian operation was executed. The legal framework for preemptive action on the basis of intelligence indicating an imminent attack on civilian vessels was not ambiguous in American military doctrine. The rules of engagement under which the strike group was operating specifically authorized action to prevent attacks on civilian shipping when intelligence provided sufficient confidence of intent and imminence. The intelligence in hand met both criteria in the assessment of the strike group's legal advisor, whose opinion the commander requested and received within 11 minutes of the initial assessment reaching him. The question was not whether action was authorized. The question was what action was proportionate and operationally sound. The fast attack boat squadron identified in the intelligence intercept was operating from a forward staging location on a small island in the northern Gulf, a position that Iranian forces had established 3 weeks earlier, and that American surveillance had been monitoring continuously since its activation. The staging location held the boats, their weapons, and the fuel and maintenance support that made their sustained operations possible. Striking the staging location rather than waiting to engage the boats in open water was both militarily more efficient, a single strike eliminating the entire squadron's operational capacity rather than a running engagement against dispersed fast movers, and operationally cleaner in terms of the evidence chain connecting the target to the stated justification. Authorization for the strike was requested and granted by 5:14 a.m. 4FA 18S launched from the Ford at 5:22 a.m., armed with JSOW glide bombs that allowed weapon release outside the range of any air defense system the island staging location was known to possess. The strike package crossed the target area at medium altitude, released their weapons in a single coordinated pass, and turned back toward the carrier. Time over target, 47 seconds. The staging location's boat pens, fuel storage, and weapons handling facility were destroyed in a strike that subsequent imagery assessed as eliminating the squadron's operational capability for a minimum of 4 to 6 months. The Iranian fast attack boats that had been at sea when the staging location was struck returned to find their base gone. 3 boats sought shelter in a civilian harbor on the Iranian mainland. 2 attempted to reach an alternate IRGCN facility further north. All 5 were tracked continuously by the strike group's surveillance assets. None made any attempt to conduct the commercial shipping strike that the intelligence had indicated was being prepared. The deterrence calculation that the Ford's movement north had been intended to establish had been tested and had held, not because Iran had chosen restraint from a position of unaffected capability, but because the specific capability that Iran had been preparing to use had been eliminated before it could be employed. In Tehran, the response to the staging location strike moved through the familiar pattern of public condemnation and private reassessment. State media described the strike as an act of war against Iranian territory, the island staging location being characterized as Iranian sovereign territory, despite its position in contested waters. IRGC commanders issued statements promising a response at a time and place of Iran's choosing. The private reassessment was more significant. Intelligence assessments in the weeks following the staging location strike indicated that Iranian military planning had shifted in character, moving away from the fast attack boat harassment doctrine that had been the primary instrument of Iranian pressure in the Gulf and toward longer-range standoff options that did not require forward-positioned assets as vulnerable as the destroyed staging location. The adaptation reflected the Iranian military's institutional capacity to learn from operational setbacks, a capacity that American planners respected and incorporated into their own assessments of what the next phase of the confrontation might look like. The Ford remained in the Persian Gulf. Her flight operations continued on their regular schedule, the sound of launching aircraft rolling across the water each morning and evening as a reminder to every vessel and every radar operator in range that American presence had not been diminished by the confrontation that her arrival had precipitated. The anti-submarine warfare teams continued their patient, exhausting search for the 2 missing Kilo submarines, locating one on the 9th day of the deployment, the second on the 14th, both having operated throughout the period with the caution of crews that understood they were being hunted. The Persian Gulf did not become stable. It never became stable. But the specific instability that the Ford's arrival had been intended to address, the Iranian escalation pattern that had been building for 6 weeks without an adequate response, had been interrupted. Not ended. Interrupted. The difference between those 2 outcomes was the difference between a solved problem and a managed one. In the Gulf, managed was what you got. Solved was what you hoped for and rarely achieved. The Ford's strike group understood the distinction and operated within it with the professional patience of forces that had been managing the same contest in the same waters for longer than most of their crew members had been alive. The carrier turned into the wind. The catapults fired. The aircraft climbed into the Gulf sky and flew their patterns over water that was quieter than it had been 3 weeks ago and would be louder again before long. That was the Persian Gulf. That was always the Persian Gulf.